They thought he was a fool. In a town where people locked their doors early and spoke in whispers, a single father stepped into an abandoned warehouse and froze. Amid the dust, a little girl clung to her unconscious mother, her swollen red eyes pleading, "My mom only has today left to live." He could have walked away, but when he followed the trail of bitter teacups and hidden ledgers, he exposed an entire web of lies that could bring down the most powerful man in town. The town of Eagle Ridge was heating up in a way no one wanted. It wasn't because of drought, and it wasn't because of a lack of water. It was because work was becoming scarce. Wages were being cut. Small shops were shutting down one after another, and every night there was some kind of shouting match in the streets. People were closing their doors earlier, speaking in quieter tones, and growing more suspicious of one another. Michael Carter walked quietly through the late afternoon market crowd, his shirt still dusted with sawdust, his calloused hands curled around his tool bag like a reflexive act of self-defense. He was 40 years old, a longtime carpenter, raising his daughter alone since his wife had passed. His kitchen always smelled of fresh-cut wood and simmering beans because he tried to keep Emily's life as normal as possible, even though this town was no longer the same as it once was. He planned to stop by Hope's Market to pick up some rice, a bit of milk, and cooking oil. As he walked past a sandwich stand, he overheard people talking about Robert Whitmore, the owner of Whitmore Textiles. More workers had just been fired for daring to protest unpaid overtime. One woman had been dismissed for supposedly stealing from the company fund. The words came out like weary sighs. The weak just had to endure it, and anyone who spoke up would get in trouble. Michael didn't like getting involved in other people's affairs, but he hated seeing how rumors crept along like snakes, slowly squeezing the reputation of someone too exhausted to defend themselves. He turned into a narrow alley to reach the main street, where the bells of St. Matthew's Church had just begun ringing to mark the end of the day. In between those chimes, another sound caught his ear, thin, broken, almost ready to fade away. A child's cry. Michael stopped in his tracks, tilting his head to listen, then quietly followed the sound into the alley. His heart sank instantly, as if by instinct, when he saw what was inside the abandoned house. A girl of about 6 sat huddled on the floor, sobbing hard, her eyes red and her small shoulders trembling. She clutched tightly to an unconscious woman, her clothes smeared with dirt, her arms and legs streaked with grime. Patches of dust caked onto her cheeks and the frayed collar of her shirt. Michael crouched so the child wouldn't have to strain her neck to look up at him. His voice was deep and steady, each word slow enough not to frighten her. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. Can you let me take a look at your mom?" The girl hesitated, holding on tighter. But a second later, her swollen eyes dropped to the ground and her voice wavered, close to breaking. "My mom only has today left. If nobody saves her today, tomorrow she won't be here anymore. Please, help my mom." Michael moved closer and sat beside them. He gently touched the woman's wrist, feeling a faint but present heartbeat. Her skin was cold, and beads of sweat dotted her forehead. "What's your mom's name?" he asked, keeping his voice soft. Hannah Mitchell," the little girl replied softly. "Has anyone done anything to your mom?" She shook her head, eyes dropping to the floor. "I don't know. It's just that she keeps getting weaker, and she can't remember things like she used to." Michael noticed the girl's small hand clutching her mother's sleeve, as if letting go would mean losing everything. He took a breath, slid one arm under Hannah's back and the other beneath her knees, and lifted her. The weight was so light it made him shudder, lighter than a bundle of lumber he would normally carry in his shop. As he turned, his steps faltered. In the corner of the room, a ceramic teapot lay on its side, completely empty. A strange, acrid smell rose from it, musty, mixed with a bitter tang. Michael frowned briefly but didn't stop. He pulled the girl closer, placing his large, warm hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the door. As they reached the threshold, the late afternoon light spilled into his eyes. But at that moment, from the back door of the warehouse, came the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps. Michael looked up. A shadow slipped quickly past, vanishing behind the row of old brick walls. He tightened his hold around Hannah, his heartbeat quickening. In that instant, he knew for certain this wasn't going to end here. When Michael got home, he pushed the door open gently, the scent of wood and dried glue filling the small room. Emily, Michael's 8-year-old daughter, ran out to greet her father, her ponytail slightly askew, the brightness in her eyes freezing when she saw the unconscious woman in her dad's arms and a little girl clinging tightly to the hem of his shirt. "Who is that, Dad?" "A stranger," But they need help, a place to rest. Get the little girl a glass of milk, make sure it's warm. Michael spoke slowly, still holding Hannah securely. He gave Emily a short nod, the kind that told her to stay calm and just do as he asked. Emily turned toward the kitchen. The faint, clear sound of a spoon tapping against a cup followed. She brought the milk back out, set it in front of Lily, then pulled her small hands back for a moment before placing the cup firmly into her friend's hands. Drink it. Your mom needs you to stay strong. Lily looked at the milk, then at her mother, swallowing hard. Thank you, she whispered, her voice still trembling. She took a small sip, her eyes still red but her fear easing slightly. Michael laid Hannah down on his own bed. He added an extra thick blanket, then wiped the sweat from her forehead with a warm cloth. Her skin was cold, her pulse as thin as a thread. He leaned his ear close to her mouth to listen. The raspy, weary breaths scraped at his chest, bringing up an uncomfortable feeling, like the sound of damp wood being eaten away from the inside by termites. He turned back to Lily. What happened? Can you tell me? Lily clutched the hem of her mother's shirt, taking in a deep breath as if gathering courage. My mom was fired from Mr. Whitmore's factory. They said she stole money from the fund. But she didn't. She just said the workers were tired and the pay wasn't enough. Then people started hating her. After that, no one would hire her. She got weaker, started forgetting things, and then she fainted. Michael's brow furrowed slightly. The name Whitmore flashed in his mind like an old scar. The man was rich, influential, and loved giving orders. He remembered the factory workers who had come to his workshop to get chairs repaired, their shirts stained with grease, each of them telling stories about working overtime without extra pay. No one wanted to get involved with Whitmore for fear of losing their job. He looked at Hannah, then at Lily. One woman completely worn out. One child standing in the path of a storm. Emily sat on the doorstep, placing a piece of bread in Lily's palm. Eat. You have to eat. Lily looked at Emily, her gaze softening a little. Your mom will need you to talk to the doctor if he asks questions. You have to tell him exactly when she started getting sick. Yes, Lily replied. She chewed slowly, as if afraid the sound would wake her mother. Michael checked again. He placed his hand on Hannah's sternum, counting her breaths. Each one felt like climbing a broken stair. He opened a drawer, took out a bottle of fever reducer, hesitated for a moment, then put it back. Hannah didn't have a fever. The problem lay somewhere else. The acrid smell from the warehouse was still fresh in his mind, bitter, strange, and perfectly matching Lily's words about her mother getting weaker. Michael leaned closer and spoke softly. Hannah, can you hear me? It's Michael. You're safe now. Hannah's eyelids trembled slightly, then stilled. Lily quickly took her mother's hand and pressed it to her cheek. Mom, I'm here. Michael pulled a chair close to the bed. Lily, has anyone been bringing your mom food or drinks lately? Like someone you know, or someone who said they were trying to help? Lily blinked, then gave a very small nod. Yes, people from the factory. They said Mr. Whitmore sent them because he cared. Usually it was a bottle of water or a cup of tea. Mom said it tasted bitter. She still drank it because they stood there watching. Emily glanced at her father, her expression changing. Michael kept his voice calm, but felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. And, since then, your mom started forgetting things? Yes, she forgot to lock the door, forgot money, even forgot my teacher's name. She said her head spun, like the wind was inside it. Lily gripped the mug of milk, a drop spilling onto her hand. Michael nodded. All right, tonight, you and your mom stay here. The door's secure. If you need anything, call me or Emily. He stood, handing Lily one of Emily's wool sweaters. Put this on, getting chilled will only make you feel worse. Thank you, Lily murmured. She slipped her arms through the sleeves, the scent of soap rising from the fabric, and her eyes softened. Emily pulled a chair next to the bed, resting her hand over Lily's. Quote, the two girls didn't say much after that. That small clasp of hands was enough to make the room feel warmer. Michael went to the kitchen, prepared a cup of warm water with a little sugar, and returned. He lifted Hannah slightly so she could wet her lips. She swallowed very slowly, as if her throat were parched to the core. He eased her back down and tucked the blanket snugly around her. The room fell silent, only her faint breathing, the ticking of the wall clock, and the taut sense of vigilance along his spine remained. Dad, Emily whispered. Should we call someone? Not yet, Michael replied. Let your friend's mom rest. and then I'll decide." He didn't want to act hastily. He needed to be certain. If it was something in the tea, he would need it confirmed. For now, the priority was keeping them safe through the night. He checked the windows, tightening the latches. His phone lay dark on the table. He hesitated for a moment, then quickly typed a note about the time, her condition, and the strange smell in the storage building. Years of working as a carpenter had taught him not to overlook details. More than once, a tiny crack in a beam had saved an entire frame from collapse. People were no different. You had to look closely. Hannah gave a faint moan. Michael stepped back to her side. "It's all right. Just breathe steadily," he said, keeping his voice slow so Lily would also feel at ease. "Tonight we're all staying here together." The room gradually settled. Emily leaned her head against the wall, her eyes still open. Lily pulled the blanket over her mother, then turned to whisper, "Mr. Michael, if he comes, can you make him leave?" Michael met her gaze. "Yes, but I won't wait for him to show up." Lily nodded. She set the mug of milk down on the floor, then sat close to the bed with her knees drawn up. Emily handed her a small pillow. "Lean on this so you don't get sore." Michael was about to say more when a heavy, urgent knocking rattled the door. All three of them jumped. He motioned for silence, stepped to the curtain, and opened the tiniest slit. On the porch, a man stood perfectly still, his face hidden in shadow, eyes fixed on the inside of the house. He said nothing. He just stood there, as if he had been there for a long time. The next morning, a series of urgent knocks pounded against the door, as if someone was demanding to be let in. Michael lifted the curtain and looked outside. A man was standing rigidly on the porch, his eyes locked on the door. Michael opened it, keeping a safe distance. The man spoke slowly, his tone flat and cold. "Mr. Carter, you'd better be careful about who you let into your home." Without another word, he turned his back and walked away. Michael watched him go. The man looked to be in his 30s, with broad shoulders, a black tattoo running along his wrist, and a snakeskin belt prominently wrapped at his waist. His name was Vincent Kane, Robert Whitmore's right-hand man, a former security guard at Whitmore Textiles. Around town, people said he didn't talk much, but he always showed up right when the boss wanted someone intimidated. Michael shut the door, locked it again for good measure, and went back to the bedroom. Lily was sitting beside the bed, her eyes following the shadow of the man as he left. She whispered, as if afraid of waking her mother, "I know him. He has a snakeskin belt." "You're sure?" Michael asked, leaning down to look her in the eye. Lily nodded firmly. "When Mom collapsed at the factory gate, he was there. I remember that belt clearly." A memory flashed in Michael's mind, Whitmore showing off the same snakeskin belt at the company's year-end gathering, his hand resting on the buckle like a display of power. Michael tightened his hand slightly, keeping his voice steady. "All right, I understand." On the bed, Hannah stirred. Her eyelids trembled and opened slightly. "Where am I?" "You're at my house. You're safe. Try to get some more rest." She tried to nod but was too weak, sinking back into the pillow. Her breathing was still shallow and sluggish. Emily came over with an extra blanket, laying it gently across Hannah's legs, then sat beside Lily. "Are you scared?" "Yes," Lily admitted honestly. She took a deep breath, glanced at her mother, and added, "But if I don't find someone to help, she's going to die." Emily nodded, her small voice steady. "We're going with my dad. You need to tell him everything you remember, every single detail." Michael sat down in a chair and quickly jotted down notes in his small notebook. Snakeskin belt, the person delivering the drinks, the fainting spells, the bitter smell. He was a carpenter, used to recording measurements and cracks in the wood, and now he was recording the truth with the same neat, deliberate strokes. This wasn't just for memory, it was to force the situation onto a clear path. He looked at the two girls and spoke clearly. "This afternoon I'll have Dr. Harris come and examine your mom. Tonight, I'm going up to St. Matthew's Church to see Father Samuel. He knows a lot about Whitmore and will show us the right way to handle this." Lily hesitated. "Who's Father Samuel?" "The priest at the church on the hill. He's helped a lot of working families. He's not afraid of power, but he's careful." By noon, Dr. William Harris was still busy at the clinic, so he sent word to keep Hannah warm, give her small sips of warm sugar, water, and monitor her breathing. Michael followed each step exactly. He propped an extra pillow behind Hannah's back and rubbed her palms to help the blood circulate. Hannah came to for a brief moment, looked at her daughter, then closed her eyes again. Not a single complaint left her lips, only the weariness at the corner of her mouth. As the afternoon wore on, Michael showed Emily how to unlock the second window, the one that led to the backyard. He set the phone on the table and pointed to the speed dial button. If anyone comes by and you don't feel right about it, you press this number. I'll be home right away. Don't open the door unless you're sure. Emily nodded, repeating each step as if memorizing a lesson. Lily listened carefully, then asked softly, "Can I sit right here and watch over my mom?" "You can," Michael said, "but you also have to eat dinner. Emily will sit with you, and you can take turns." Before leaving, he checked the locks on the door again, pulled the curtains closed, and switched off a few lights so the house wouldn't draw attention. He took a small kitchen knife from the drawer and set it on the counter not to use, but as a reminder to stay alert. Everything was ready. He looked at the two girls one last time. "I'll be gone for a little while and then I'll be back." The walk to St. Matthew's Church wasn't far. Michael took the side alleys where there were fewer people, avoiding curious eyes. By the time he arrived, the iron gate was halfway closed. He knocked 3 times, just loud enough to be heard. A figure appeared behind the door. It was Father Samuel Hayes, a man in his early 50s, lean but steady, his bright, calm eyes, the kind that could quiet a person without a single word. "I'm here because of Hannah Mitchell," Michael said, "and because of Whitmore." Father Hayes opened the gate wider, gesturing for him to step inside. "I figured as much. Come in and keep your voice down. The walls have ears." They sat in a small room next to the sanctuary. Michael spoke quickly, leaving nothing out. The bitter smell of the tea, the snakeskin belt, the man from that morning, and Hannah's fainting spells. Father Hayes didn't interrupt, only nodded at times or asked a short question to confirm a detail. Finally, he stood and walked to a wooden cabinet, pulling out a thick envelope sealed with wax. He placed it in Michael's hands, his voice low but firm. "Inside is the truth, something a person spent their whole life paying the price for. Read it, but don't keep it at your house. Tomorrow morning, take a copy to Dr. Harris. Give another to someone you trust. We're going to need the whole town to stand witness, not just one person." Michael gripped the envelope. The letters inside suddenly felt heavy, as if the weight of an entire story was waiting to be called by its real name. He nodded, tucked it inside his jacket, and took a deep breath to steady himself. Then he rose, thanked Father Hayes, and prepared to head back, knowing that after tonight, the line between fear and truth would no longer be blurred. Michael sat in the small room of St. Matthew Church, switched on the desk lamp, and opened the envelope Father Samuel Hayes had just given him. At the top of the page was the slanted handwriting of Mrs. Martha Cooper, the former housekeeper for Robert Whitmore. She wrote that for many months she had seen Whitmore instruct someone to bring healthy drinks to Hannah Mitchell. She had personally washed the glasses, and when she sniffed them, there was still the bitter, acrid smell of henbane mixed with another dark-colored herb. She added that every time Hannah turned her back, Whitmore would adjust the lid of the pitcher and swirl it slightly. She saw it happen, but stayed silent out of fear. At the end of the letter, she left one short sentence. "If someone is reading this, it means I no longer have the strength to speak. Don't let her die as a thief." The ink was smudged at the bottom of the line, like the trembling mark of an aged hand. Michael folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. All the pieces were starting to find each other. He thanked Father Hayes, promised to deliver a copy to Dr. William Harris in the morning, and left the church. On his way home, he checked his phone, no missed calls. He quickened his pace. As soon as he reached the door, he noticed the porch light flickering as if someone was lingering just outside. At the walkway, Vincent Kane stood slightly to one side, both hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He was in his early 30s, with the sloped shoulders of a man used to fighting. Few words but a hard gaze. Beside him were 2 unfamiliar men, one with a buzz cut and a stocky, brawler's build, the other tall and thin with a sharp chin. Michael recognized them from Whitmore Textiles. Mark Benson and Ethan Ross, the ones who handled security and reminders for the workers. Keeping his voice steady, Michael opened the door halfway. "What do you want?" Vincent gave a thin, cold smile. "She owes Mr. Whitmore. We're here to take her back." "She's sick," Michael replied, standing straight, his hand still gripping the edge of the door. "Leave before I call the police." Mark stepped forward halfway, chest out, shoulders shifting as if ready to force the door. Vincent raised a hand to stop him, never taking his eyes off Michael. "Mr. Carter, you know calling the police right now will only make noise, and noise isn't good for someone who's ill." Michael didn't move aside. He shifted his body to block the gap entirely. Noise or not, you're not coming into my house. The moment stretched just long enough to see who would back down first. Ethan glanced around, idly turning his car keys in his hand. Vincent looked up at the streetlight, shrugged as if conceding the first round. Fine. Tonight. He turned away, leaving one last sentence to fall onto the brick path. But you won't keep them forever. The three of them withdrew, the shadow of their car sliding past the gate. Michael closed the door, locked it twice, and turned back toward the room. Emily had already drawn the curtains tight and was holding Lily close beside the bed. The footsteps outside the porch had been enough to make both children shrink into themselves. Emily whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "My dad won't let anyone hurt you." Lily asked softly, "Is your dad scared?" "Yes," Emily answered honestly, her eyes still fixed on the door. "But he doesn't run away." Michael placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, nodding as if to acknowledge his daughter's answer. He checked Hannah's breathing again. It was still shallow, but steadier than in the afternoon. He poured some warm water, set it on the nightstand, then sat down in the chair. He told the two girls briefly, "Mrs. Martha Cooper wrote in her letter that someone had put herbs in your mother's drink. It's not her fault. We're going to prove it." Lily blinked, the words escaping quickly. "Do you believe my mom?" He looked straight at her and spoke slowly. "I do, and I'm not just saying that." Lily's small arm loosened. She nodded, as if her body was finally allowed to take a deep breath. Emily pulled the blanket up over her friend's shoulders and murmured, "You need to sleep a little. Tomorrow you'll have to explain everything to the doctor." Michael stood up to check the windows. He slid a wooden bar into the latch, set a chair under the back door handle. When he came back, he pulled another notebook from the drawer and quickly wrote a few lines. Vincent Kane came with Mark Benson and Ethan Ross. Demanded to take Hannah. Indirect threat. Did not let them in. Writing things down was his way of making fear stand in line. His phone buzzed lightly. A message from Dr. William Harris read, "I'll stop by at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Don't let her drink anything unfamiliar." Michael replied, "Understood," and put the phone away. He sat back down next to the bed and spoke quietly to Hannah, even though her eyes were still closed. "You're not alone. Tomorrow we'll have the proof." The night grew heavier. Emily and Lily took turns dozing off. Michael didn't sleep. Every time the wind rattled the tin roof, he lifted his head and listened. Near midnight, he went to the kitchen, boiled some water, dropped in a few slices of ginger to warm his stomach, then came back and rested his hand on the edge of the bed to make sure that faint breath was still there. By dawn, the house was silent. Michael cracked the curtain before opening the door. The street was still empty. He put on his shoes, stepped outside to take a long breath to clear his head. But as he reached the porch, he stopped. At the corner of the street, a few houses down, a dark-colored car sat motionless, the same one from yesterday. Its windows were tinted, and part of the license plate was obscured by dust. The engine was off, the lights were out. It just sat there like a half-closed eye. Michael exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the car. He knew the man had left the night before, but his shadow lingered. He went back inside, locked the door, looked at the two girls, then at Hannah. In his mind, one thought settled firmly. If they were watching, he needed to get ahead of them. And to get ahead, he needed more truth. This morning, the doctor would confirm it. In the afternoon, he would return to St. Matthew's Church. And that car, he wrote it down in his notebook, underlined twice, as a reminder that the darkness hadn't completely pulled back. In the morning, Michael saw the dark-colored car still parked at the corner of the street and decided not to wait any longer. He put a coat on Hannah, wrapped a scarf around her, lifted her into his arms, and told Emily to carry the bag and hold Lily's hand. The four of them took the alleyway, turning past 2 rows of houses to avoid the main road. As Michael walked, he glanced over his shoulder, keeping his breathing steady, trying to mask his tension so the 2 girls wouldn't be frightened. The gate of St. Matthew's Church opened slightly when he knocked 3 times. Father Samuel Hayes greeted them, a lean man with bright, steady eyes that looked accustomed to facing difficult matters. He didn't ask many questions, simply reached out to take Hannah from Michael and motioned for them to move quickly down the hallway. He opened a wooden door leading to the bell tower cellar. The air below was cool and still. The scent of old wood, candle wax, and altar cloth mingled together, feeling more safe than cold. Michael laid Hannah down on a folding bed, pulled the blanket up to her chest, then handed the opened envelope back to Father Hayes. He briefly explained about Vincent Kane the previous night, the 2 men who were with him, and the mysterious car. Father Hayes listened intently, only nodding when he needed to confirm something, then stored the envelope inside a locked cabinet. "You're not the only one," he said slowly. "Plenty of people know Whitmore is cruel, but they stay silent out of fear. In this town, fear has a way of finding its path faster than justice." Emily took a few sheets of paper and a box of pencils from her cloth bag. She spread the paper out on the long bench and motioned for Lily to sit beside her. The two whispered very quietly so as not to wake Hannah. Emily drew the outline of a belt first, then waited for Lily to add details. Lily added a coiled snake, marked a tiny crack on the buckle, and said that it had been sunny that day and the buckle had glinted. "I looked closely because I was really scared," Lily said in a soft but firm voice. "So I put every little thing into my head." Michael studied the drawing and nodded. He could see the scattered pieces fitting together through a child's memory. "Tonight," he told Father Hayes, "I want to go to the old factory archives. If there were welfare fund records, there has to be a place where traces are kept. He couldn't have erased everything." Father Hayes laced his fingers together, thought for a moment, then told him to sit. "I know of an entrance few people remember. The side door has been boarded up, but it can still be opened if you have the right tools. Tonight, when the streets are quiet, we'll go." Hannah stirred slightly. Michael was at her side immediately, supporting her shoulder. Her eyelids lifted, her eyes clouded with fatigue. Am I at the church?" she asked, then gripped his hand as if afraid of falling into an empty space. "You don't owe me or my daughter anything. Don't let yourself get pulled in." Michael gave her hand a gentle squeeze to reassure her. "I'm not going to abandon someone on the edge of dying when I can do something about it. And if I keep quiet, tomorrow someone else will be falsely accused." Hannah looked at him for a long moment, her eyes wet but calmer, then loosened her grip and exhaled slowly. Father Hayes made a pot of warm water and told Emily to use a small spoon to give Hannah's daughter sips to drink. Emily did exactly as instructed, her hands steady but gentle. Lily folded her own handkerchief and placed it under the cup, as if trying to keep a little order amid the disorder. Meanwhile, Michael took out his notebook and wrote down the key points: the person bringing the drinks, the smell of henbane, the snakeskin belt, the mysterious car, Vincent's threat. He didn't describe them at length, only recorded enough so the memory would have something to hold on to. A middle-aged woman walked past the doorway to the basement, giving a slight nod in greeting. Father Samuel Hayes gave a brief introduction. "Mrs. Ellen Wright, the caretaker of the sacristy." She set a basket of cornbread on the shelf and left immediately, not looking any longer than necessary. Michael Carter nodded his thanks, understanding that in this place, kindness followed the rule of quietness, few words and only what was necessary. "Have you thought about the doctor yet?" Father Hayes asked. "Let him know the preliminary results and make a backup." "I sent him a message last night," Michael replied. "He's busy this morning, but he'll stop by around noon. I'll give him a copy of Mrs. Martha Cooper's letter to keep." "That's good," Father Hayes said. "Every piece of evidence should have at least 3 copies, kept in 3 different places." Hannah Mitchell opened her eyes again and looked at her daughter. Lily quickly took her mother's hand and whispered that she had drawn the belt belonging to him so they could give it to the men helping them. Hannah's smile was faint, then she turned to Michael. "Thank you," she said in a weak voice. "I don't know what else to say." "Just rest," Michael answered. "We'll take care of the rest." Time in the church's bell tower basement passed slowly but steadily. Small tasks were done carefully, each one fitting into the next. The way Michael assembled a doorframe, measuring precisely, setting it in place, wedging it just right. He instructed Emily and Lily to stay put in the basement, and if anyone unfamiliar appeared, to go 1 level lower and pull the wooden screen closed. He left his phone on the shelf, set to speed dial Dr. William Harris. "Just press the green button," he showed them. "If it rings 3 times and no one answers, call again." Once everyone was settled, Michael stood beside Father Hayes to settle on the timing. "When do we go?" he asked. "After it's fully dark," Father Hayes replied. "Around 9 o'clock. We'll leave through the back door of St. Matthew's, cut through the old cemetery, then cross to the north wall of Whitmore Textiles. There's a rotted plank there, just needs a thin crowbar." "I've got one," Michael said, "and a small flashlight. I'll keep the beam low, won't shine it directly on the windows." Father Hayes looked at him, his voice low but firm. "Tonight, I'll take you to the place Robert Whitmore never imagined anyone still remembers, the place that could bury his whole truth. We'll go in, take what we need, and slip out quietly. The rest, we'll let daylight handle." Night had already settled in when Father Samuel Hayes led Michael Carter out of St. Matthew's Church through the back door. They moved along the stone wall, crossing the old cemetery, their steps light to avoid making any sound. Michael wore a small flashlight clipped to his chest, its beam lowered just enough to illuminate the path ahead. Neither man spoke much, exchanging only brief nods to keep pace. The Whitmore Textiles factory loomed ahead like a solid block of darkness. The main gate was locked tight. Father Hayes pointed toward the north side, where the wall had a side door whose lock had been broken ever since the time he came in to hold a service for a worker killed in a weaving machine accident. After that, he murmured, Whitmore had the files cleared out, but people only clear away what they can see. Michael nodded, understanding. The things hidden away often sat right beside the things everyone looked at. When they reached the side door, the iron lock was half rusted. Michael pulled out a thin pry bar, found a point of leverage, inhaled, and eased it in bit by bit until the metal groaned once and gave way. The sagging hinges let the door open part way. A musty smell mixed with old machine oil drifted out, sharp and stale. Michael pushed the door just wide enough for them to slip inside, closing it immediately behind them. The darkness inside was heavy. They stood still for a few seconds to let their eyes adjust before Michael switched on his flashlight, casting a low beam across the concrete floor. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust. On a few doors, the old Spanish labels were still visible. Contabilidad, Personal, Seguridad. Father Hayes brushed his fingers lightly over the letters, as if confirming they were in the right place. "You've been in here often?" Michael asked quietly. "Not often," Hayes replied, "but enough to know my way around. I came here to hold a funeral service for the worker who died in this place. After that, people were afraid, and they sealed it off. Fear doesn't make the truth disappear, it just leaves it lying in wait for someone to touch it." Michael began searching. He pulled on thin gloves, opened drawer after drawer, lifting file bundles and blowing dust from the covers. He didn't read everything, only scanned the indexes, checked dates, and memorized where each thing belonged. When he came across a handful of cash disbursement slips hastily stapled at the back of one folder, he stopped. They were marked as emergency assistance payments, but listed no recipients, only initials. He gathered several sheets together and clipped them aside. Father Hayes moved to the cabinet labeled Personal and pulled out an employee ledger. He flipped quickly to the column marked Terminated. There was a block of names crossed out in red immediately after the note, Petition for better working conditions. He murmured, "They were fired within a week of speaking up." Michael tilted the flashlight so Hayes could copy the information in pencil onto a scrap of paper he carried. They moved deeper into the records room. At the far end, a low wooden crate sat beneath two cardboard boxes. Michael lifted the boxes aside and bent over. The crate's lid was sealed with old packing tape. He slid the pry bar under and worked it loose. Inside was a small wooden case, its edges bound with black fabric tape. When Michael touched it, a chill ran along his spine, not from fear, but from the certainty that this was what they had come for. He placed the case on a table and opened the lid. The flashlight's beam fell on items arranged as if meant to tell a story. The first photograph showed the factory yard during an awards ceremony. In the center stood Robert Whitmore, crisp white shirt, hand on his hip, the snakeskin belt gleaming in the sunlight. Behind him, the weaving machines stretched in neat rows. Michael brought the photo closer, recognizing that the date stamped in the corner matched exactly the day Hannah Mitchell had collapsed, the very day Lily had described. He drew in a deep breath and carefully slipped the photo into a separate evidence folder. Beneath it was a stack of petty cash vouchers, each stamped by accounting, showing large and regular sums marked as welfare fund, but with no recipient listed. A few of the sheets were accompanied by hastily handwritten internal distribution lists, the slanted script resembling the handwriting of the person who logged overtime hours. Michael flipped to the very last layer and found a thin ledger labeled Job Transfers, which in reality listed workers who had been fired immediately after signing a petition for better working conditions, each name marked with the note, Troublemaker. "Enough to make him pay," Michael said quietly, his voice not triumphant but weighted, like the creak of old timber under strain. "But it's going to get more dangerous." He placed everything into a hard file folder, immediately dividing it into two parts, one to take with him and one to hide elsewhere in the storage room, marked with a discrete code so he could retrieve it if he was intercepted. Father Samuel looked at him and asked directly, "Are you ready?" Michael stayed silent. His gaze didn't waver. and after a moment he gave a slow nod. "If I back down, tomorrow someone else will be pushed into the dark. I'm not ready for that." Father Samuel laid a hand on Michael's shoulder for a brief second, like a wordless blessing. They checked the room again to make sure there were no obvious signs of disturbance. The cabinet doors were closed as before, the dust lightly spread back with a cloth. Michael turned off his flashlight, then switched it back on at a lower beam, angling the light toward the floor as they prepared to leave. Slinging the file folder across his shoulder, he gave a signal to move. Just as they neared the side door, a dry, hard sound echoed in. Heavy footsteps struck the cement hallway floor. Then a familiar man's voice, no need to look to know. "Vincent Kane, I know you two are in there." Michael froze, his eyes locking with Father Samuel's in a brief moment. They didn't panic. They only slowed their breathing. Michael pressed a finger to his lips in a silent warning, then shut the flashlight off completely. Darkness filled the space again. Outside, the clink of a lock was followed by the sound of a palm testing the door. Vincent spoke again, his tone dropping low, as if talking to someone unseen. "Don't make me come in there tonight and drag you out." Father Samuel tilted his head and whispered so quietly it was barely audible. "The side door still has one latch inside. If you hold it here, I can lead you through the narrow passage to the back courtyard." Short but tight. Michael nodded, shifting his body to brace his shoulder against the door, keeping the latch from rattling. On the other side, Vincent's footsteps moved slowly to the right, like a predator sensing its prey. The space seemed to shrink and thicken. Both men knew that one wrong sound could mean everything in that file would change hands in an instant. Michael signaled. He and Father Samuel slipped back to the corner of the room, stuffed the wooden box into a burlap sack, and covered it with a few stacks of old papers. Once done, he drew a deep breath, gave Samuel a nod. The two of them cracked the door open and stepped into the dark hallway to face the man waiting for them. Vincent Kane was leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, eyes narrowed as if he'd already seen everything. He glanced at the sack slung over Michael's shoulder, the corner of his mouth curling upward. "Hand over what you just took." Michael didn't move. His voice was low and steady. "If you want it, come and get it." Mark Benson and Ethan Ross emerged halfway from the shadows, but from the alley, the light of an apartment switched on. On a small balcony, an elderly woman poked her head out to look down. Across the street, George Allen, the night guard for the city's water plant, a stocky, middle-aged man with sharp eyes, stopped his bicycle at the gate. He looked straight toward the mill and called out, "Something going on here?" A dog barked unevenly somewhere in someone's backyard. Suddenly, there were witnesses. Vincent lifted a shoulder. He knew the line he couldn't cross. He stepped back half a pace, brushed the dust from his sleeve, and said just loud enough for the two of them to hear, "You're going to regret this." Then he turned and walked away, his two men trailing after him. All three vanished into the darkness the same way they'd come. Michael exhaled, but didn't let his guard down. He and Samuel returned to the room for a final check. The burlap sack now slung crosswise over Michael's shoulder. The files split into two parts as planned. They took the long way out, leaving the mill through the side door, cutting quickly across the cemetery and back to St. Matthew's Church. The gate shut, the bolt slid into place. Their heart rates slowly eased. Down in the bell tower's basement, Emily and Lily startled when they saw the two men return. Michael set the sack on the table and opened it. The wooden box was still intact. He handed it to Father Samuel. "Keep it here. If anything happens to me, you give it to the federal police." Samuel nodded, locking it away and fastening the iron latch with care. A short while later, Dr. William Harris arrived. He was in his mid-40s, thin, wore glasses, spoke little but never wasted a word. He carried an envelope containing the test results from the water sample Michael had taken from the teapot at the abandoned warehouse. Harris opened the file and pointed to the conclusion line. "Herbal mixture containing henbane and a nightshade. Family alkaloid. Low dose, cumulative. Symptoms: muscle weakness, dizziness, short-term memory impairment. This is not acute poisoning, it's slow erosion." He looked at Hannah, his voice firm. "This is deliberate poisoning, not illness." Lily gripped the edge of the table as if something were pulling her back and she had to brace herself. Emily wrapped an arm around her friend's shoulders, saying nothing unnecessary. Michael gave a grateful nod. "Doctor, I need 2 copies of the results. One for Father Samuel, one for me. You keep the original in case anything happens." Harris agreed without hesitation. He pulled a small portable printer from his backpack, connected it, printed 2 copies, signed them, and stamped them with the clinic seal. Everything was neat and precise. While the adults talked, Lily reached into her mother's cloth bag to look for a handkerchief. Her fingers brushed against a hastily torn piece of paper, folded in quarters and tucked into the edge of the bag. She unfolded it. The handwriting was a woman's, messy from being written in a rush. "Don't drink what he brings." Underneath was a long exclamation mark, as if someone had tried to shout but didn't have the chance. Lily handed it to Michael, her eyes wide. "It's Mom's paper." Michael looked at the handwriting, his fingers pausing for a beat. He placed the paper next to the photo of the snakeskin belt and the payment vouchers inside the box, then said to Father Samuel and Dr. Harris, "We've got the chain, the person delivering the drinks, the poison, the symptoms, the warning note, the list of those fired, the welfare fund vouchers, and the photo of the belt taken on the exact day." He spoke slowly, as if hammering each nail into a wooden frame. "Enough to build a bridge, and tomorrow we'll walk across it in front of everyone." Harris nodded. "I'll be there. I'll cover the technical part. Chemical evidence can't be argued away," Father Samuel added. "I'll testify to the time, the place, and to Mrs. Martha's words. The community will listen when they see the real people involved." Hannah opened her eyes and saw the paper in Michael's hand. She tried to push herself up, her voice hoarse. I wrote that, but I forgot where I hid it." Michael lifted her shoulders and adjusted the pillow higher. "You don't have to remember it all anymore. We'll remember for you. Tomorrow we'll speak out in the square. No one will ever call you a thief again." Lily crawled closer, resting her forehead on the back of her mother's hand. Emily sat right next to them, leaning in to whisper so Hannah could hear. "Lily and I will be standing right under the stage. If you look down, you'll see us." A simple sentence, but it tied another thread to the heart of an adult. Father Samuel brought over a basket of cornbread from Mrs. Ellen, telling the 2 girls to eat so they'd have strength. Michael didn't force them, but he watched until each of them had finished a piece. He organized the evidence into 3 separate bundles, one to be kept in the church's locked cabinet, one to give to the doctor, and one to carry himself. Each bundle had the photo, the vouchers, the list, the lab results, and the warning note. No single bundle was the only copy. When the church clock struck 11 at night, everyone was in position. Hannah was lying down, her breathing more even. The 2 girls were curled up together under a thin blanket, nodding off in each other's arms. Michael stood by the staircase, letting his eyes move over each face in turn. He didn't say much. He only gave Father Samuel and Dr. Harris a short nod, as if sealing a promise that needed no words. Before dimming the lights, Michael bent down and whispered into the darkness, as if speaking both to himself and to someone long gone. "Tomorrow, we're not hiding anymore." On Market Day morning, Liberty Square was packed. Michael Carter slowly guided Hannah Mitchell step by step, while Lily Mitchell and Emily Carter held hands up front to make a path. Father Samuel Hayes walked beside them, carrying a file bag under his arm. Dr. William Harris had with him the envelope containing the lab results. At the end of the line, Mrs. Martha Cooper leaned on her cane. Her face was tired, but her eyes alert. She wanted to speak herself about what she had kept inside for far too long. In the middle of the square, the long table of the town council was already set. The council president, Mayor Thomas Grant, was in his early 50s, with a composed posture and a slow, measured voice. Beside him sat the council secretary, Mrs. Karen Brooks, pen ready in hand. 2 municipal police officers stood a few steps away to maintain order. Across from them, Robert Whitmore sat with his legs crossed, his dress shirt perfectly pressed, a faint smirk on his face as if none of this was worth his concern. Vincent Kane stood behind his boss with arms folded, eyes wandering yet missing nothing. Michael placed the file bag neatly on the table and opened it. He laid each item out in a straight line. Irregular cash disbursement slips from the welfare fund, a list of workers fired right after signing a petition, Hannah's hastily written note reading, "Don't drink what he brings," and 2 copies of the lab results. He spoke slowly, clearly, looking straight at Mayor Grant. "Hannah Mitchell did not steal," Michael began. "She was poisoned because she dared to say no to Mr. Whitmore. Here is the evidence, each piece connected by dates, signatures, and witness statements." Mrs. Brooks took the documents, skimmed them quickly, then handed them to the mayor. He nodded toward Dr. Harris. Harris stepped forward and placed the envelope before the council. The liquid sample was taken from the tea container found in the abandoned building where the victim was staying, Harris said. The results confirmed the presence of henbane and a nightshade, family alkaloid in small cumulative doses. The symptoms match Mrs. Mitchell's condition: muscle weakness, dizziness, short-term memory loss. This was intentional poisoning. I sign my name and take full responsibility for this conclusion. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people covered their mouths. A former factory worker, standing by the metal barricade, spoke just loud enough to be heard. I was fired 3 days after signing the petition for longer breaks. My name is on that list. He didn't give his name aloud, but he raised his hand as if claiming his testimony. The mayor turned to Father Hayes. "Father, do you have anything to add?" Father Hayes stepped forward half a pace. "I confirm the dates and locations. I once held a service for a worker who died in the plant after a textile machine accident. After that, many records were removed. I am also the one who received Mrs. Cooper's letter when she was no longer able to report it herself. I testify to the authenticity of the letter and the chain of custody of the evidence." Mrs. Cooper gripped the edge of the table, taking a deep breath to steady her voice. "I am the former housekeeper for Mr. Whitmore. I saw him order drinks to be delivered to Hannah. I smelled the bitter, acrid scent in the cup. Once, I saw him gently shake the lid of the container when she turned away. I kept silent out of fear. Today I speak because someone stood up when I no longer had the strength." She turned to Hannah. "You did not steal. The guilt lies with the one who poisoned you." Robert Whitmore gave a mocking smile, spreading his hands as if watching a stage play. "Touching stories. Photos can be taken at any time. Lists can be retyped. And who's to say what the tea smelled like?" He leaned back, his eyes turning cold. "The council will not destroy the reputation of the town's largest taxpayer over a few pieces of paper and some hearsay." Michael Carter didn't respond to him. He turned directly toward the council. "I'm not asking anyone to believe words alone. I'm asking you to look at the chain of events. A person who opposed exploitation, an employer who brought her drinks, a confirmed sample of poison, a string of firings immediately after a petition, a handwritten warning from the victim, a photograph with a date matching the incident. If that's not enough, then what is?" Vincent Kane shifted his foot, ready to cut in, but Mayor Thomas Grant struck the gavel once without looking at him. The mayor turned to the crowd. "If anyone witnessed the drinks being delivered, please step forward and state your name." From the right, a short-haired woman in work clothes stepped out, introducing herself as Jessica Coleman, who had once worked in the mill's cafeteria. "I was told to pack pastries and a bottle of water for Miss Hannah Mitchell, recorded in the ledger as Welfare Fund. One time I saw Mr. Master Tanjastri Dove." Kane checked the basket before it was sent out. She finished, clenching her hands before stepping back to her place. The crowd buzzed again with whispers. Some pointed toward Whitmore, others pulled friends closer. 2 police officers who had been keeping their distance now sat up straighter. Hannah gripped the armrest, looking out toward the front of the stage. Emily and Lily stood right at the barrier, faces turned upward. Emily raised a thumbs up, while Lily placed her hand over her chest as if promising to stay still. Hannah drew a deep breath, the fear in her eyes thinning. Dr. William Harris produced another copy of the report and handed it directly to Mrs. Karen Brooks. "If the council doesn't act according to the law, I will forward this case file to the state by the end of today. I will also submit it to the Medical Association to have it recorded as an occupational poisoning case to protect other victims." Mayor Grant looked at each person in turn, then down at the stack of documents spread before him. He didn't speak immediately. He motioned for 2 council members to lean in, and they held a brief exchange. Mrs. Brooks took notes without pause, her pen never stopping. Finally, the mayor looked up, striking the gavel twice to silence the murmurs. "We have heard enough for a preliminary decision," he said, slow and clear. "The council will vote today." The gavel struck 3 times. Mayor Thomas Grant read each word slowly so everyone could hear clearly. "The council has voted. The result: Hannah Mitchell is officially exonerated. A criminal case will be filed against Robert Whitmore for poisoning, defamation, and threats to life." A moment of silence followed, as if a great weight had been lifted. Then Liberty Square broke into murmurs. Some people clapped, others simply let out long breaths. Captain David Foster, head of the city police, stepped forward with 2 officers. Calmly, he held out a pair of handcuffs. "Mr. Whitmore, you'll need to come with us." Whitmore rose, smirking faintly, but there was defeat in his eyes. Vincent Kane jerked forward, ready to interfere, but the officers quickly pinned him on both sides. Foster gave a small nod. "You too, Vincent. And the other two," he pointed at Mark Benson and Ethan Ross, "for intimidation and obstruction of an investigation." The click of the cuffs closed around their wrists. The crowd parted on its own. Those who once lowered their heads in fear now stood tall, watching. No one shouted, but their gazes were long, heavy, and clear. Vincent shot Michael Carter one last glare, lips curling in a silent threat. Michael didn't respond, he only tightened his grip on the handle of the evidence bag. Mrs. Karen Brooks gathered the paperwork and stamped the receipt of record. Dr. William Harris signed an additional copy, authorizing its use in court if needed. Father Samuel Hayes leaned close to Hannah and spoke softly, almost like a prayer. "Today, you walk out with your true name." Hannah nodded, her eyes wet but shining. People from the town drifted over. No one made grand speeches. A few former factory workers stopped in front of Hannah, nodding as if to say they were sorry. Jessica Coleman placed a new handkerchief in Hannah's hand and whispered, "I'm sorry I came too late." Hannah squeezed her hand once, offering no reproach. Lily Mitchell clung tightly to her mother, tears soaking Hannah's wrist. "You're not a bad person," the girl blurted, as if afraid the words might slip away. "No, sweetheart," Hannah replied, pulling her into her arms. "I'm not." Emily Carter stood nearby, holding Michael's hand. "Dad, they're safe now, right?" Michael looked at the mother and daughter, then around the square. "They're safe," he said, "but we'll keep watching." The police escort led the arrested men out of the square. Mayor Grant returned to the microphone to announce the next steps: the temporary suspension of the factory's operations for an audit of the welfare fund, a review of all termination contracts, and the drafting of a new labor regulation. He pointed toward the secretary's desk. "This afternoon, the council will hold an emergency session to pass a resolution against exploitation and establish an independent oversight committee." The crowd nodded. There was no thunderous applause, but many faces had eased. On the steps of St. Matthew's Church, back in the safety of home ground, Mrs. Ellen Wright and the women's church group set down baskets of bread, milk, and cold medicine on the stone benches, then quietly walked away. They left no names and no notes. Father Hayes simply said, "Take what you need." Emily opened a lid and slid it toward Lily. "Here, drink this. Your mom needs some sugar, too." Lily nodded, wiped her eyes, and did as she was told. The following days passed quickly but were filled with work. Captain David Foster took statements from each person involved and arranged protection for the witnesses. Dr. William Harris reassessed Hannah Mitchell's health and outlined a recovery plan for her short-term memory through rest and proper nutrition. Father Samuel Hayes and Michael Carter created additional backups of the case files, sending one copy to the county's public attorney. Rumors gradually turned into official news. A week later, the council announced its decision to take temporary control of Whitmore Textiles and sell it to a new owner. Richard Collins, an entrepreneur from out of state, appeared at the public introduction. His appearance was simple, his words few, and he emphasized, no hidden funds, no firings for filing grievances. He signed the new labor regulations right in front of the workers, mandatory breaks during shifts, paid overtime, and an anonymous channel for reporting concerns. Councilwoman Linda Park read the new resolution against exploitation and the creation of an oversight committee elected by the community. What once felt like luxuries had suddenly become official clauses. People began returning to work. This time, the factory doors opened with a neatly posted set of rules. Jessica Coleman returned to the cafeteria, hanging on the wall a menu of affordable, well-balanced lunches. Someone smiled when they noticed the last line: free drinking water, self-serve. Hannah walked more slowly than the others, but with each day, her steps grew steadier. She was not working yet, Dr. Harris had advised her to recover fully first. Michael had built her a sturdy armchair in the church kitchen's corner, where she could watch the children play without feeling faint. Lily Mitchell and Emily Carter worked on another drawing, still of the rattlesnake belt. But this time beneath it they carefully wrote a new phrase: no more fear. Late in the afternoon, Michael stood on the porch, looking out at a strangely peaceful street. Councilwoman Linda Park passed by, paused, and leaned toward him. "You've made a lot of people afraid," she said, her tone neither harsh nor soft. "But today the community stands with you." She stepped back and added a parting thought: "Don't let the silence come back. It moves fast." Michael nodded. He knew the road ahead would still have its rough patches, but he also knew he would no longer be walking it alone. Inside, The two girls giggled over a word puzzle. At the table, Hannah looked up at him, her eyes enough to say that here, the word family had finally found where it belonged. A year had passed, and mornings in the small house began with the sound of spoons clinking against cups and the smell of fresh-baked bread. The door wasn't locked, only pulled to so the breeze could slip in, and the footsteps of two children running in and out felt as familiar as breathing. Hannah and Lily had been living with Michael and Emily for a long time now. Everything had fallen into place without much needing to be said. "Sweetheart, take this basket to the church for me," Hannah said, handing Lily a basket of freshly baked conchas. Her hands were steady now, her voice no longer trembling. "Leave it at the door like always, and remember to say hello to Mrs. Ellen Wright." "Yes, ma'am," Lily replied with a bright smile. Emily, her school bag slung over her shoulder, leaned in to whisper, "After school, let's stop by the workshop and help Mom with the ledger." Michael stepped out from the carpentry shop, sawdust still clinging to his hands. "Be careful out there, and stay close to the curb," he reminded them, giving each girl a gentle pat on the shoulder. He no longer glanced over his shoulder as often as he once had, but the habit of keeping watch had never really left him. At St. Matthew's Church, Mrs. Ellen Wright opened the door, her eyes crinkling with a warm smile when she saw the basket of bread. "Thank you, dear. We'll make sure it gets to someone who needs it." Father Samuel Hayes stood in the hallway, greeted them with hands clasped, and asked Lily two short questions about her reading assignment at school. She answered clearly, a quiet pride showing in her voice. Back at the workshop, Hannah sat at the tall work table and opened the ledger. She wrote neatly, "Wooden chair for Mrs. Nancy Porter, kitchen shelves for Mr. George Allen, repaired door latch for Hope's Market. Don't take on 2 deliveries in one day again," she reminded Michael, her tone firm but warm. "Your back will start hurting again." "Got it," Michael said with a small smile, leaning over to check the back of a chair he'd just sanded. He didn't argue, he knew she was right. From the doorway, Dr. William Harris walked in, wearing a simple button-up shirt and holding a small bag of medicine. "Just a quick check," he said. "Your short-term memory is improving well. As long as you keep eating and sleeping regularly, you'll be fine." Hannah nodded, thanking him without ceremony. Harris glanced at Michael and grinned. "And you stopped doing everyone else's work for them." That afternoon, Lily and Emily came home from school, talking over each other in excitement. "Miss Julia Thompson said I should read my piece on stage today," Lily said in a low voice, though her eyes shone. Miss Julia, her new homeroom teacher, had a way of encouraging her students to speak from the heart instead of memorizing empty lines. "I rewrote it 3 times, but I'm still a little nervous," Lily admitted. "That's okay, being nervous is normal," Michael said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Just look down at me, and you'll feel less nervous." Hannah stepped beside her, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I'll be standing right next to your dad, look at both of us." The Spring Festival opened at Liberty Square. Stalls displayed fresh fruit, handmade crafts, and strings of brightly colored paper flags. Mayor Thomas Grant gave a short speech about the new labor regulations. Councilwoman Linda Park reminded everyone that the Independent Oversight Committee had now been running for 3 months, receiving feedback from workers through a secure Dropbox. Richard Collins, the new mill owner, spoke briefly. "No hidden funds, no threats. If you see something wrong, speak up." People didn't break into loud applause, they simply nodded, as if agreeing to keep each other decent. When it came to the students' turn, Miss Julia Thompson called out, "Lily Mitchell." The little girl stepped forward, clutching a sheet of paper folded in half to keep her hands from shaking. Emily Carter stood below, holding Hannah Mitchell's hand. Michael Carter stood beside them, his eyes fixed on his daughter without blinking. Lily took a deep breath, her voice clear. "I love my mom, and I love my dad too." She paused for half a beat, as if wondering whether she had said everything she needed to, then went on, each sentence short and steady. "Because my mom taught me never to lie, and my dad taught me never to give up. If one day I'm afraid, I'll look down to where my parents are standing." Liberty Square fell silent. Even the vendors stopped what they were doing. No one hurried her, no one coughed. The only sound was the soft rustle of paper as she set it down. Michael stepped forward and pulled his daughter into his arms. He didn't need to say anything else, he just whispered, "You did great." Hannah stood beside them, her eyes shimmering, quickly brushing away a tear at the corner of her eye, as if she didn't want her daughter to see her weak. Lily wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, smiling even as tears rolled down her cheeks. Emily touched Michael's shoulder, grinning with her gap-toothed smile. I told her it would be fine. When the program ended, the four of them walked hand in hand across the square. This time there were no wary glances. People greeted them as they would any neighbor. Doctor. William Harris nodded from a distance. Mrs. Martha Cooper sat on a stone bench, holding a rosary, and when she saw Hannah, she lifted her hand in a gentle wave. Captain David Foster passed by and stopped to greet them, saying nothing more than a firm pat on Michael's shoulder in place of the words, "It's all right now." On the way home, their front door was still ajar. Emily went in first, pushing it gently so the late afternoon light spilled inside. On the kitchen table, Hannah had already set out 4 warm mugs. Lily hung her teacher's card on the wall, and taking a pen, carefully wrote one more line, "Gracias por quedarse." Thank you for staying. No one corrected the spelling, and no one asked her to rewrite it neatly because those words were already perfect for this family. Michael stood at the doorway, looking out onto the street. The breeze nudged the curtain. He no longer felt the constant need to guard the door like a sentry, but the habit of listening still made him lift his head whenever a car passed. He turned back inside, watching the 3 of them busy with the little tasks that kept this house alive. Then he spoke slowly, as if placing a promise on the table for all 4 of them to see. This town still has work to do, but now we'll do it together. Has there ever been a moment when a single quiet sentence pulled you out of silence? Michael Carter stepped forward because of a trembling plea for help, and he stayed because of the truth. This story does not sugarcoat anyone, nor does it soften evil. It simply shows that when one person dares to stand tall, the community will eventually stand with them. Evil can hide behind money and fear, but evidence, persistence, and human decency will outlast every layer of dust. And as we've seen, the one who spread poison must wear chains. The wrongfully accused has their name restored, and a new family is born from courage and an open hand. I want to leave you with a simple message. Never underestimate a timely act of kindness. Do not walk away when the truth needs someone to stay. Justice does not arrive on its own, but it will come when we each do our part. What do you think of Michael's choice? If it were you, hearing a whisper like Lily's, would you stop? What touched you most in this story, the father's courage, Mrs. Martha Cooper's honest voice, or the light returning to Hannah's eyes? In the place where you live, what needs someone to speak up first? And let me ask, are you doing okay today? Is there a worry you're carrying that you wish someone would hear? The comment section is always open, and we read every single one. If this story touched you, leave a note, share an experience of your own, or suggest a topic you'd like us to tell next. Thank you for being here. We will keep telling stories where good people are rewarded, and the darkness is forced to retreat.